Got it. Thanks.
Today we're going to stop for a minute and reflect on the first 5 books of the Bible. So we've kind of made a long journey. We've made our way through the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're going on to Joshua, but before we do that, I want to pause and just say a word about where we've been. Obviously, I'm going to do a lot of summarizing here, so hopefully it will be helpful. So it's really important to remember that the first 5 books of the Bible are known in Judaism as Torah, which means something like instruction, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Penta meaning 5, the first 5 books. Now, it's really important also to remember that within Judaism, the first 5 books of the Bible were regarded as the most authoritative, which of course means that they were the most authoritative for both Jesus and for Paul. So here's an example of that. This is from the 22nd chapter of Matthew, verses 23 and following. Jesus is asked a question about the resurrection. Now, little footnote here. The Sadducees who are asking the question, one of the things that was unique about them was they only accepted the authority of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And of course, in their reading of that, there's nothing about resurrection said explicitly in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, so they didn't believe in the resurrection. They also didn't believe in a Messiah either, because for the same reason. So here they come to Jesus, and they don't believe in the resurrection, and their goal is to kind of make him look stupid. That's the goal here. So here it is. The same day, the Sadducees came to him who said there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." So the Sadducees are citing a provision in the book of Leviticus that says that if you have a brother who gets married and he dies childless, then it's your job to have children by your sister-in-law for your brother. So that's what they're referring to here. And that's the beginning of their little test. And so here's their scenario. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So to the second, third, and down to the 7th. So in this scenario, the brother who's married dies. His next brother marries his wife, and then before they can have children, he dies, and that keeps going till finally all seven brothers have been married to the same woman in this scenario. Yes, this is I hear she's trouble, right? After them all, the woman died. Okay, now here's the question. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they were all married to her. So this is their way of trying to make the resurrection look ridiculous, okay? And so the picture here is that somehow, like in the resurrection, you'll have like 7 men saying, "She's my wife. No, she's mine. No, she's mine." Just to make it look like all ridiculous. Now, it's important to notice what Jesus says about this. But Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. As for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God?" And now Jesus quotes here from Exodus 3:6. "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living." And the crowd heard it. They were astonished at his teaching. Jesus says, okay, you guys say that the first 5 books of the Bible don't teach the resurrection. You're wrong, because when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, he refers to himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Not, I was the God of Abraham, I was the God of Isaac, and I was the God of Jacob, who are now all dead. I am. And so Jesus says, actually, that points to the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, the first 5 books of the Bible teach resurrection. Therefore, you are obligated to believe it. Therefore, leave me the hell alone. So it's just really important that we really want to kind of note here, right, that these first 5 books carry enormous weight, both for Judaism and then also for Jesus and also for Paul. As we've discovered, right, as we've read through these first 5 books of the Bible, we've learned that they're an interesting mixture of both law and narrative. The Jewish way of dividing this up, I think, is really helpful, because it refers to law as all law in the first 5 books comes under the denomination of Haggadah, which literally means how to walk. That is, law, right, is instruction on how you're supposed to walk, on how you're supposed to live your life. So there's Haggadah, there's halakha and Haggadah, so narrative and law. And the idea here, right, is that they're both necessary to understand one another. That is, law isn't just simply a series of rules and regulations that are sort of like unloaded on Israel. Rather, in order to understand the purpose of halakha, you have to understand the Haggadah, the narrative. In order to understand the law, you have to understand the narrative. And a good way, I think, to see this is right at the beginning of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. There's a preface to the 10 Commandments, and that preface is really important. It's God says to the people of Israel, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore, you shall have no other gods but me. You notice what's going on here? Before Israel receives the law, she's being reminded of what God's already done for her. And therefore, what God's doing is he's laying out for them how he wishes them to respond to what he's already done for them. That is, what halakha does is it guides you in how you are to receive and respond to God who's already been gracious for you. Okay? So really important. And a second thing that's going on here that I noted when we were walking through, especially Leviticus, it's also really important to notice here, right, that Torah or halakha, how to walk, instruction, is introduced by God into a world that's been fragmented by sin. That is, the purpose of Torah now is to begin the process of reintroducing order to a disordered world. Okay, so it's really important. It's the beginning of God's work to sort out the chaos that sin has introduced into his creation. More about that in just a minute. So here's a really important point about how Christians read the Bible. This may sound kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually true. As Christians, right, we don't read the Bible from beginning to end. We read the Bible from end back to the beginning. Because in our way of thinking, right, you don't really understand the real meaning of the Old Testament until you see it from the standpoint of its fulfillment. Okay? So remember, there's that really wonderful moment in Luke's account of the resurrection in Luke 24. It's that story about the walk to Emmaus. And remember, Jesus is walking along the road with the 2 disciples, and we're told that beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them all the things about himself in the scriptures. This is what I call the world's greatest Bible study. Okay? And the point of the world's greatest Bible study is not to sort of teach you an additional doctrine or to give you a couple more helpful hints for happy living. The purpose of the world's greatest Bible study is to help you see the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament, and you're looking at it. Okay? It's not a thing or something that you do. It's a person. It's Christ who's the fulfillment. So we're now looking back at the Old Testament from the standpoint of its fulfillment. Now, if we do that right, what would we say, or what would be a helpful thing to say about the first 5 books of the Bible? Well, here it is. I think we can say 3 basic things about the first 5 books in terms of their theme. They contain 3 really important themes. Theme number 1, creation. Theme number 2, decreation. And theme number 3, recreation. So creation, decreation, recreation. Let's take a look at it. It's all out there on the sheet that I've given you. So I'm going to just kind of sketch these 3 things out. Now, Genesis 1 through 2, I think, is often sort of misread. Today, a lot of people kind of want to read Genesis 1 and 2 as, in effect, being sort of like a quasi-scientific account of the origins of the universe, and therefore almost kind of like serving as an alternative to like various modern cosmologies. I think that's the wrong way to read it. It's reading Genesis 1 and 2 not with its own concerns in mind, but with our concerns forced upon it. Almost in the same as you would pick up a cookbook and, insist on reading it as a novel, right? And, you're like 2/3 of the way through the cookbook and you say, this is an awful novel. I mean, there's no plot, there's no character. I mean, who the heck wrote this thing? And you throw the book against the wall. What Genesis 1 through 2 is doing is something actually more important than providing us with a quasi-scientific account of creation. It's telling us something about what creation actually is. So let's take a look at that. What is creation? Creation is a number of things, but the most basic thing that it is, we're told, in Genesis 1 through 2, is creation is the gift of existence itself. If you exist, you are a beneficiary of the gift of creation. Apart from God's creative gift, apart from God's generosity, there would be no universe at all. Creation, therefore, is a gift of God. And therefore, right, creation does something really important. Creation is, in effect, a display of God's generosity, God's goodness, and God's love. Now, I think that's a really important statement to sort of think about, right? Because we're being told here, Genesis 1 and 2 is telling us, creation is telling us that generosity, goodness, and love are the most basic and fundamental and real things in the universe. They are not lovely spiritual ideals which you just might want to embrace some point in your own private little life. The choice is not between goodness, generosity, and love and some sort of other version of the world. The choice is between God's goodness, generosity, and love and hell. That's the choice. Okay? So the creation narrative is telling us something really real and something really important, and that is that God's goodness, generosity, and love are actually the most important and potent powers in the universe. And therefore they can be relied on. Okay? So that's an important thing to know. We're also told something else about creation. We're being told that creation is the place where God and his covenant creatures, us, meet face to face. It's a really important point. Someday we may actually arrive at the moment where we finally understand everything there is to understand about the physical origins of the universe. We may arrive there one day. Some physicists don't think so, others think so. We'll see which ones are right. But even if we somehow came to an understanding of a full and complete knowledge of the physical origins of the universe, we still wouldn't know the most important thing about it. We would not know that it's a product of God's goodness, love, and generosity, and we would not know that it's the place that God has created for us to meet with Him face to face. And therefore, our knowledge would be radically incomplete and also lacking. Now, here's an interesting point. If we ever make it to 1 Kings, we'll see this. Sometime in the next 10 years, we'll get there. I'll be kind of sitting here with my walker or my wheelchair at that moment, but, we'll see. In 1 Kings 6, we're told something that's, I think, really significant. 1 Kings 6 deals with the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. And in 1 Kings 6, the interior of the temple is described. And it's really interesting because the interior walls of the temple are decorated with palm trees and pomegranates and flowering bushes. In other words, the interior of the temple looks a whole lot like the Garden of Eden. And there's something significant in that. The temple in Jerusalem apparently was thought of as a kind of microcosm of creation. That while the world outside the temple was fallen and corrupt and filled with all kinds of violence and all sorts of other human evil, the temple was the one space in the whole world that had been restored to the way it was in its original goodness. And therefore, the temple was sort of a promise, right? Today, this little space, tomorrow, the whole thing gets taken back. And sure enough, if you read Revelation, and one day we'll get there too, maybe like 20 years from now, if you read the end of the book of Revelation, right, you discover what happens. Creation's been turned back into a temple. So I think there's a really important note about creation. One final thing about creation, that is, what we're told about creation in Genesis 1 through 2 is really important because there are different ways of understanding creation. Let me give you an example. We have a number of ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. So most ancient Near Eastern cultures had their own accounts of creation. One of the most important ones, is the one that comes from Babylon, the sort of great military, economic, and political colossus as in the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonian creation story is really, really different from anything that we find in Genesis 1 through 2. So let me summarize it and then we'll just note the differences. So in the Babylonian creation story, I'm trying to stay out of the sunlight here. Not because I fear the light because my deeds are evil, but because I want to be able to see. Well, my deeds may be evil, but I'm moving anyway. That is, the idea here is that in the Babylonian creation story, creation comes about when the chief Babylonian god, whose name is Marduk, he and his fellow gods engage in a combat with his sort of opposite, a goddess by the name of Tiamat. And Tiamat is kind of like this enormous dragon. And finally, Marduk wins the battle. And what he does is the battle ends when Marduk slays Tiamat. And what he does is he takes her corpse and cuts it in half. And with one half of her corpse, he makes the world. And with the other half of her corpse, he makes the heavens. And then, this is the crowning touch, with some of her guts and intestines, he forms humankind. I'm waiting for this to come out as a movie, because I think it would be really successful. So notice what's going on here, right? Notice what this story tells us about the world. Thing number one, for the Babylonians, it makes no sense to be bothered or disturbed by murder, by violence, by destruction, by human evil. Because, folks, that's just the way the world is. The world was created in a battle, and it will always be a battle. It's not going to change. And you folks, right, you're nothing special, because what you are is parts of Tiamat's intestines that Marduk molded together. So human life doesn't really matter in this story. Notice we get a very different picture in Genesis 1 through 2. First, there's no battle. Creation comes about when God says, "Let there be," and it is. No battle, no struggle, no violence, just creation, blessing, life thriving. And here's the good part, we actually weren't made from Tiamat's guts. I know that comes as a huge relief. Or let's put it this way, most of us weren't made from Tiamat's guts. How about that? We were made in the image of the Creator. So notice this, right? For Genesis 1 and 2, as we look at the world around us, and as we see like evil and destruction and violence and chaos and people killing one another and lying and cheating and greed and, the whole 9 yards, Genesis 1 and 2 wants us to realize all that actually doesn't belong in God's created order. It's been introduced by the sin of human beings. And because none of that actually is part of God's original creation, it will not last. When the new creation comes, it's not just that sin and violence and human degradation are going to be sort of really well managed. It is that they are going to disappear because they don't belong here. And that's good news, right? That is, Genesis 1 through 2 is proclaiming the good news of creation. And that's part of Israel's hope. So that's creation. Now let's talk about decreation. And here I'm thinking about the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. Now, we typically call what happens in the 3rd chapter of Genesis the fall, right? I think decreation is a better word, so let me argue for that. And some of you will leave here saying, "I still think fall's better," or something like that. But anyway, here we go. In Genesis 3, the chief issue isn't that the man and the woman decide to break a rule by eating of the tree that's in the middle of the garden. Okay? It's not like, they're wandering around, there they are in the garden, there's this tree over there, it's got a fence around it, and the sign says, "Visitors to the garden are kindly requested not to eat of the fruit of this tree by order of the management." And that's when they climb over the fence and have a bite. Genesis 3 actually gives us something far more serious. The promise that's held out to the man and the woman is the promise of knowing good and evil, which is a Semitic expression which means not knowing the difference between right or wrong. That's not what it means. Knowing good and evil here means determining good and evil. That is, the temptation that's held before the man and the woman is having the ability, the authority, to determine what is good and what is evil regardless of God. That's the temptation that's put out before the man and the woman. And of course, we know what happens. We know, right, that the story ends with the man and the woman being expelled from the garden. And I think what we're getting there is something that's really important. The man and the woman are expelled from the garden because they are no longer fit to dwell in God's presence. They've rejected him. They've rejected his order of things. And as we find, right, as the whole thing kind of spins out of control, we find out that what happens is that in seeking to be the determiners of good and evil, what they actually end up doing is they actually end up degrading and diminishing themselves. And therefore, that's why I want to use this word decreation. Sin does not simply result in people doing naughty things, although it does. Sin does something else. It literally destroys those who engage in it. Sin degrades and destroys those whose lives it rules. It makes them less than they actually were. And so the problem or the issue now, after Genesis 3, after this decreation, right, isn't God trying to find a way to make everybody behave like good boys and girls again. The problem is literally recreating a creation that's in the process of destroying itself. Here's one way that I think we get a good picture of this. In Genesis 6, 11 through 12, which is the part of the story of the flood, we're told that God now is looking at the creation that he's made. So now notice what's going on. Genesis 6 is giving us God's picture, God's perspective on what's gone wrong. And this is the report that we get in Genesis 6, 11 through 12. Now the earth was corrupt, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Did you notice the repetition of the word corrupt? And the earth was corrupt, and they corrupted their ways, and they became corrupt, and, da-da-da-da. Of course, this word corrupt, right, is another word for another really important Old Testament word that we've looked at. And that word is unclean. Creation has rendered itself unclean, impure, self-destructive. Those of you who have read C.S. Lewis's science fiction trilogy, and if you haven't, it's a great read. In the second book, which is called Perelandra, there's a character, he's the central character of the three novels. His name is Ransom. And that's significant, by the way. That's sort of a theological insight into what he's doing. Ransom is in combat with a scientist whose name is oddly divine. And as the novel progresses, we learn something about this guy, this scientist. We learn that he's actually evil. Not just that he doesn't have any morals or, that he kind of makes mistakes. We learn that he's actually evil. Now, the thing here is that the people on Perelandra, and this is part of the narrative, this is part of the story, there's no sin on Perelandra. Perelandra has intelligent life, but there's no sin. And so the inhabitants of Perelandra actually have no framework to place divine in, because they don't know anything about sin or fallen people. And so they give divine, or they talk about him as the unman. And I think it's a great insight on Lewis's part, right? Under sin, we are all, in effect, unpeople, unhuman. And what God needs to do is not just give us some new morals or give us proper doctrines. What God's involved is actually restoring our humanity that we've lost. So that's decreation. And now, recreation. Let's talk about that for a minute. The themes of recreation, I think, surface in at least 3 ways in the first 5 books of the Bible. So let's take a look at them. And I think in many ways this is important because this becomes like the fundamental storyline of the whole rest of the Bible. So recreation involves a couple of important things. The first is this: recreation involves the calling of a people who will live against the grain of a decreated humankind. So think about where this occurs. It's the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. And this comes right after the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. So remember what happens in the story of the Tower of Babel? The builders say, hey, look, let's show everyone how great we are. We're going to build a tower all the way up into heaven. We are going to pole vault ourselves up into heaven and show just how great we are, and show that, all this idea about God being exalted, that's just all fairy tale. If we build this tower high enough, we'll build it all the way up into heaven, and we'll be where God is, and we'll show that we're kind of his equals. So they begin building this tower, and they kind of build it, right? And then there's this funny moment where God has to come down to look at the tower. And God, has something of a sense of humor about this, and basically says to the builders of the Tower of Babel, oh, so you've built a tower. How nice. Because it actually doesn't make it up all the way up into the heavens, okay? Then we have the call of Abraham. So let me read it to you. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Notice that the 2 stories are almost like polar opposites. Story number 1, Tower of Babel. We are going to make ourselves great. We're going to build this tower. We're going to show the world how great we are. Let's go. Abram is called to be faithful. He's called to follow the call of God. And if this happens, God's going to make him great, and God is going to use him to bless everyone. 2 very different stories. That is, recreation here involves like a choice. It's a choice that we're all kind of given. And this leads to the second thing. Recreation involves us being called back to the true human vocation. And what is that true human vocation? Well, it's given to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai in Genesis 19. And that vocation is essentially this. You and I are to be stewards of creation. You and I are to be a royal priesthood. And you and I are to be the servants of God. That's our vocation. It's only by engaging in those things that we can actually really become human again. That's the idea. So we're given a choice. We can choose to be tower builders and to be people who are like focused on our own greatness and whose attempt to make ourselves great actually contributes to the chaos and destruction of the world. We can choose to do that. Or we can choose to be servants and stewards and priests. And in doing that, we can have our humanity given back to us by God. So once again, the true human vocation. So notice what we have now. We've got covenant people living in the true human vocation, and now the third and final component. Recreation involves a movement from enslavement to freedom. Enslavement to freedom. That's essentially the story of the Exodus, isn't it? The people of Israel are freed from their bondage in Egypt, go through the Red Sea, march to the wilderness, and go to the Promised Land. And when we pick up the story next, we'll find them entering the Promised Land. So here are the three components of recreation: faithfulness to God, true human vocation, being liberated from bondage and entering into true human freedom. Now, there's a lot there, but let me just make one final point, because this is where I have to stop. You may have noticed that these three things offer a sketch, not only of what real human life looks like, but it's also a sketch of a particular human life. And that is, in its sketch of recreation, the first 5 books of the Bible offer us an outline of Christ. Complete faithfulness, recovery of the human vocation, living in true freedom. In effect, what we're getting in this description of recreation is a picture of the one who is the new creation in person, and that's Christ. One final thing, there's a wonderful passage in the letter to the Colossians where Paul clearly has this whole dynamic in mind. It's just a verse, but you can kind of get a sense of what he's doing. So this is in Colossians 3. And he's describing the Christian life here, but notice how he describes it. This is Colossians 3:12. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. And above all, put on love, which binds everything in perfect harmony. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. And let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom and insight, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. That is, notice what Paul's described. Paul's description of the Christian life is first and foremost a description of Christ, with us kind of like falling in and being formed into that mold. So I think those are really important things to remember. What we'll do next Sunday is we'll start the book of Joshua. And one of the things we'll do is we'll pay particular attention to how the crossing of the Jordan River occurs, because there are a number of really important things that occur as the people cross. Now remember, just for the sake of kind of keeping the picture straight, remember, there are going to be 3 tribes that are going to remain on the west bank of the Jordan, while the other ones are going to cross into the land. And so we'll see how all that works out next Sunday.